violent extremism in Canada. I'm the co-director of TSAS, which is the Canadian Network for Scholarship on Terrorism, Security and Society. And I'm also co-lead of the North America group at the Defense and Security Foresight Group, both of which have mandates to research security in Canada and to make policy recommendations based on that knowledge, and who are the co-hosts of the event today. So welcome. We're very happy to have you. Both TSAS and the DFSG are located at the University of Waterloo, which is in the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. It's situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Kitchener-Waterloo is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, as well as those who came as settlers or immigrants of this generation or earlier generations, including those brought involuntarily to Ontario as part of the transatlantic slave trade. We are all treaty people. And we take particular note of the ways in which Indigenous people, Black people, Muslims, and those who have been designated as others have suffered from state and community violence when they have been broadly and wrongly labeled as terrorists, and acknowledge the responsibilities that we have as scholars and practitioners to counter this violence as we seek to better understand our subject matter. And we're here today on the 6th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on Parliament Hill on October 22nd, 2014. And so today we also remember Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who was killed by a shooter at the War Memorial on Parliament Hill that day, and the lawyer, the nurse, the bureaucrat, and the 3 soldiers who tried to save his life and comfort him as he died: Barbara Winter, Margaret Lair, Martin Magnan, Colonel Conrad Mielkowski, Corporal Kyle Button, and Corporal Anthony Wiseman. And we also remember Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent, who was killed in a terrorist attack using a vehicle just 2 days before that attack on Parliament Hill, and all Canadian victims of terrorism. And so our panelists today will turn their attention to the past and future of terrorism in Canada. Unfortunately, Dr. Michael Zehaf-Bibeau, who was supposed to be a presenter today, was unavoidably unable to present today as advertised, and he has sent his regrets. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we go further. The way this presentation is set up, because there are, it looks like 128 of you, which is fantastic. There's no audio or video for the attendees. And so if you have a question, please use the Q&A box that should be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And if you could please, if there's an option to do so, choose the option to send to all panelists, and that makes sure everybody will see it. And I will triage and ask those questions then at the end of the 3 presentations. We're going to go in the order in which the presentations were advertised today, and each of our 3 speakers will speak to you for approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll have a general question and answer at the end. And so our first speaker, I'm very pleased to welcome Steve Hewitt from the Department of History at the University of Birmingham. He is a British-Canadian academic interested in security and intelligence in the past and present, and in a Canada, United States, United Kingdom context. His work has covered a range of topics such as state surveillance against Canadian universities, UK and US counterterrorism, a history of informants, and the world's most famous police force, the RCMP. He's written several books and articles related to security intelligence, such as A History of Canadian Policing and Security, Counterterrorism in the UK since 9/11, and the use of informers by the police and intelligence services. And Steve Hewitt will speak to us today on the subject of shooting, bombing, and vehicle attacks, a history of male lone actor terrorism in Canada. I will pass it over to you now. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for joining. It's nighttime here. I was interested in Veronica's introduction. I'm one of those sort of settlers, as in I was born in Kitchener, and I'm sort of a repatriated settler back in the UK, but I still have family in the area, and I acknowledge, that I grew up on Indigenous land, and it's great to hear that reflected. I also want to acknowledge the horrible events of 6 years ago today. And in some ways, the project I'm talking about today stems from that and the aftermath, especially some of the media coverage. One of the things that struck me about the coverage of the attack of 6 years ago was some of the media coverage in the aftermath. Talked about Canada having lost its innocence and even compared the attack to 9/11. And what struck me was, in a sense, the lack of historical memory. Thinking of the horrible Air India bombing of less than 30 years before the 2014 attack, but also that it was not the first attack on Parliament. In May 1966, a man by the name of Paul Chartier carried a homemade bomb with dynamite packed with shrapnel, sat in the public gallery in the House of Commons. He was someone who had a history of violence, had a history of criminality, had drifted in and out of jobs, had a history of spousal abuse. And he was someone that connected his own personal struggles with what he saw as the wider problems in society, which he blamed on politicians, on political corruption. So he wrote a manifesto, a very populist manifesto. He sent a copy to the Edmonton Journal. He made up a copy, carried it with him, went to the House of Commons, no security, sat in the public gallery with a viable explosive with the Prime Minister and all of the MPs sitting down in the House. He then went out, lit the fuse, and the bomb prematurely exploded, killing only him. And this is an event, obviously, if he had been successful, this would be an event that we remember and still talk about today. But because it was not successful, despite, you can see the newspaper headlines, the shock at the time, it's one of those events that slips out of our attention. But again, is part of the sort of history of lone actor terrorism in Canada that I want to talk about today. If we could go on to the next. History and terrorism aren't necessarily friendly or familiar bedfellows, in the sense that much of the scholarship, obviously when it comes to terrorism, is heavily dominated by the social sciences, is very much focused on events of the present. It's led to critiques, including from the critical terrorism studies people. And I should say I'm not sort of an adherent of that, but I accept some of their points. And their argument is that this leads up sometimes to scholarship that's ahistorical, acontextual. And also others have pointed out that, it leads to a certain dominance and a certain maybe unipolar way of thinking when it comes to the topic of terrorism. Now, there's a second issue as well, I think, that connects to this project and in some ways problematizes everything I'm talking about today. And that is, when it comes to lone actor terrorism, there is no set definition. And if you look at the scholarship, there are multiple definitions. There are examples that appear in some scholarships, some well-known scholarships, such as the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. Some scholars include that as an act of lone actor terrorism. Others don't. So there's an issue already in terms of definitions. People talking about dyads, as in more than one attacker. Scholars talking about so-called lone wolf packs of groups of attackers. So the whole field, in a sense, is problematic, and I guess that sort of parallels the wider issues around definitions of terrorism, obviously, that have bedeviled terrorism studies going all the way back to the 1970s. So what I'm talking about today, in a sense, intersects two projects. One is currently I'm working on a history of terrorism and counterterrorism in Canada that's contracted by McGill Queen's University Press and hopefully will be out in the next few years. I should be actually on a study leave right now working on it, but sadly, because of the pandemic, all study leaves at my university have been deferred. So that's part of the project. Within that book will be a chapter on a history of lone actor terrorism in Canada, but I'm also interested in doing a wider history of lone actor terrorism, specifically in Canada, the US, in the UK. And I put up a couple of images just to reflect on the fact that lone actor terrorism has a long history stretching back to the 19th century. So the book on the right, it was written by a German anarchist by the name of Johann Most. It was published in 1883. This is the English language version that came out more recently. In the book, Most makes it clear that if someone has an idea for an attack, they should just go and do it. That they shouldn't wait to share it with anyone else, just go and do the attack. And we saw repeated attacks by anarchists at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, that were lone actor terrorist attacks, including most famously, which is the other image, the killing of President McKinley in Buffalo, New York, by a lone actor terrorist and anarchist in 1901. So it's the 120th anniversary of that next year. So these two projects intersect, and I'm going to talk specifically about the Canadian angle to the history of lone actor terrorism today. So it's almost like a cliche, but here are my definitions. So a definition of terrorism there, but more importantly, my definition of lone actor terrorism, which actually comes from Ramon Spage in his book Understanding Lone Wolf Terrorism. And I've taken specifically a very narrow definition of lone actor terrorism. So Spage, for instance, would not include the Oklahoma City, in fact, explicitly doesn't include the Oklahoma City attack as an example of lone actor terrorism because more than one person was involved in that attack. So you can see it's about people that operate individually, do not belong to an organized terrorist group or network, and their modi operandi are conceived and directed by the individual without any direct outside command or hierarchy. And if we look at the deaths in Canada from terrorism, if we don't include post Air India, all the deaths, as far as I'm aware, have all been carried out by lone actor terrorists, which speaks to obviously the significance of this particular type of terrorism when it comes to the history of terrorism in Canada. So based on that definition, those two definitions, and with the excellent help, of TSAS for the grant, which I'm very grateful, which allowed for multiple trips to archives, including the Library and Archives Canada, and also allowed me to employ an excellent research assistant, Mark Irving. I was able to identify 19 potential lone actor terrorist attacks stretching all the way from 1868 to 2018. 1868. The figure on the left is Patrick Whelan, who shot and killed Thomas D'Arcy McGee, an Irish-Canadian politician. Whelan was a Fenian and was influenced by Fenianism, although he was not part of any organized Fenian group. And some of them you may recognize, obviously quite notoriously, including Mark Lepine, including the attacker of 2014, and all the way up to the alleged driver of the van in Toronto. And I've got a few X's, which is to indicate the individual that's just on trial, so has not been convicted. The other X denotes someone who was actually acquitted of terrorism charges. And the stars at the top row are actually not the images of the attackers, because I haven't been able to find the images of the attackers, but all of the other images pertain to attackers or alleged attackers. Now, so there's something that ties 18 of the 19 individuals, something they have in common, and I'll come back to that later. I've done this detailed research paper, and this is just one example of the sorts of categories in the research paper. So this is actually an attack that occurred in 1965, carried out by someone by the name of Harry Hewitt. It was an attack actually at Edmonton Airport. It involved Hewitt effectively executing a security guard and then setting bombs on 4 U.S. warplanes that were stationed in Edmonton, destroying 3 of the 4 planes. Hewitt was motivated out of anger over the Vietnam War. He actually tried to go to Vietnam to actually fight for North Vietnam, was deported, I think, from Japan. And again, he fits the sort of pattern we see with other lone actor terrorists. He had marital problems. His wife left with the children, moved back to West Germany, which is where he was originally from. History of violence, and again, engaged in this attack, was put on trial, was convicted. The judge, and I think this is a telling phrase, described it as a one-man war that Hewitt was carrying out. He was sentenced to death. Eventually, the death penalty was not carried out, and he ended up serving a lengthy prison sentence before being released. But this is the sort of looking at tactics, looking at preparations in terms of all the attackers that the project breaks down throughout. So some of the characteristics that come out and that I think reflect the sort of work that you see with someone like Paul Gill and John Horgan and Paige Deckard in their book their article Bombing Alone and Gill's other work, including a book. Average age, in the low 30s. In the Canadian case, guns being quite prevalent, bombs, knives, vehicles. Over the 19 attacks, 52 non-attacker deaths and 78 injuries. About a third of the attackers died during the attacks. And again, even though it stretches obviously all the way back to 1868, there's been this uptick since 2012. Roughly half the attacks occurred since 2012. 2012 was the attack carried out at the Parti Québécois celebration party the night of the Quebec election on 4th of September 2012. And this is a graph of the attackers. The blue dots represent the age of the attackers, and the bottom line is when the attacks occurred. And again, it just reflects what was mentioned on the previous slide, the heavy prevalence of attacks post 2012. But you can see the range of ages stretching out right across over that 150-year period. So what are the key findings? If you look at a breakdown about motivation, the most frequent motivation for an attack has been Islamism. Those attacks have occurred obviously since 2012, but they also equate to low casualties. If we look at far-right attacks, those have been much deadlier, although fewer in number. If we include misogyny as a separate category, and obviously if you roll that in with far-right, that increases the number considerably. But if you look just at misogyny, that itself has been the deadliest of all. And you can see the statistics there in terms of the number of attacks versus deaths, over the last however many different years and different attacks. A few other aspects that come out, the low educational levels of attackers, which again maybe speaks at times to problems in life, failed opportunities. The individual Chartier, who I mentioned at the beginning, the 1966 attack, drifted through life through a number of jobs, careers, moved back and forth between Canada and the U.S., changed addresses frequently. Also, prevalence of people who are single, divorced, separated, again, speaks to certain turmoil in their personal life. The final point, which is something I really reflect on in the paper, it's something I think that doesn't get enough attention, and that is gender. And normally when we talk about gender and terrorism, it's because women are involved, and there's this sort of assumption that gender only applies to women. And one of the things I argue in the paper is that we need to talk a lot more about masculinities. We need to talk about the way that for some men, that violence becomes an acceptable response to grievance. I mean, there's increasing research tying in mass shooters with terrorists, lone actor terrorists, this idea of grievance. But of course, many people have grievances in their life. Many women have grievances in their life, but not all carry out mass casualty attacks. Some scholars are writing about this, Michael Kimmel being the best example. This idea, again, that we sort of normalize male violence. We don't reflect on, we just accept that as normal, that men will be overrepresented among terrorists, and especially among lone actor terrorists. And as I said in my sample, it's almost 100% male. We need to reflect more on why men are overrepresented. Almost exclusively, lone actor terrorists are male. And obviously the same thing, again, applies to mass shooters, as we can see in the United States. And I've got a quote up from Kimmel's book, Healing from Hate. So what does that mean in terms of policy recommendations? And the first point, I think, just imagine if 18 of the 19 attackers were female. Just imagine if 18 of the 19 attackers came from Saskatoon. Just imagine if 18 of the 19 attackers were of a particular religion. We would reflect on that. We would be talking about, why is that taking place? What does that mean in terms of trying to counter violent extremism? How does that need to be approached by policymakers? And I really think there needs to be a conversation about gender and about masculinities, and that maybe, and I'm actually quite skeptical of CVE programs, and I think it's so complex as to why people actually engage in violence that, of course, it's impossible to reduce it even to masculinities, and it doesn't absolve individuals of responsibility responsibility for their violence. But if we're going to have those programs, and if they're going to focus on, other aspects, other characteristics, including religion, then we also need to talk about gender. And finally, and this is a plea as a historian, that there needs to be a wider awareness of the history of terrorism. And I think it would serve a policy goal in the sense of decentering the present, of reducing snapshots of violence, that if we only look at a small period of time, certain communities can appear to be overrepresented in the violence, and that leads to stigmatization, that leads to backlashes, that leads then, of course, to alienation. So, for instance, if we think about the terrorism in Western Europe since 9/11, you might be surprised to know that actually more people were killed by terrorism in Western Europe in the 1970s and 1980s than have been killed since 9/11, despite 7/7, despite the Paris attacks, despite Marseille. So again, this is a problem that just hasn't appeared overnight. We look at the United States. If you look from 1970 to the present, the year with the most attacks, the most individual attacks, was actually 1970. Pipe bombs, far left attacks, Klan, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole history there that I think would help reduce some of the fear and some of the overreaction to terrorism on the part of policymakers, on the part of the media, on the part of the politicians, if there was a greater awareness of the history. And I'm trying to do that role and do my little bit in pursuing that. Thank you.
I will introduce our next panelist, Shannon Harris-Hogan. Comes to us from Australia. He represents Research Solutions, but is also an adjunct research fellow at Victoria University. He's an Australian CVE consultant with more than a decade of experience working for both the university and government organizations. He's currently an adjunct fellow at Victoria University, and he holds master's degrees in international relations from Monash University and in research from Macquarie University. His research focuses on understanding violent extremism and analyzing the structure of terrorism. His applied research focuses on helping to facilitate disengagement from violent extremism through the design, implementation, and evaluation of CVE programs and policy. Since 2010, he's been involved with more than a dozen counterterrorism and CVE applied research grants with partner agencies, including the Victoria Police, the Federal Attorney General's Department, I'm assuming that's the Australian Attorney General, and the Australia-New Zealand Counterterrorism Committee. Shannon is a longtime friend of TSAS, and we are very pleased to have him at an event again. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thank you for having me here today, Veronica. And it's a shame I can't see everyone in person, but it's a really great pleasure to be part of such a really good lineup there, at least virtually anyway. I just want to say thank you to all of you taking the time to listen to both myself and to the other presenters. I know how difficult it can be to get time away from your inboxes, especially in 2020. So thank you for taking the time to listen in to us. I also want to quickly apologise in advance, just in case any of the following doesn't make any sense. I promise it's not an issue with the data or the research. Rather, I'm on about day 110, 111 of lockdown in Melbourne in Australia. We're getting pretty close to eradication here, but I fear my brain's a little bit fried from 3 or 4 months of walking around my own apartment by myself. So hopefully we'll get through and there won't be any tech glitches. I won't fall off my chair, but I'm just getting my excuses in beforehand, just in case. In terms of what I am going to cover for the next 10, 15 minutes or so, I'm probably going to talk and do exactly what Steve just suggested you don't do in terms of research. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature and the evolution of the jihadist threat to both Australia and Canada, both separately and combined, but specifically across the last 20 years. So from 1 January 2000, the turn of the century, through to the beginning of 2020. We're halfway through what's a 2-year project looking at this topic, and I'll present some of the data and findings from our first year of work. Our focus thus far has been exclusively on domestic actors in both Canada and Australia. So what I'll present incorporates all Canadian and Australian jihadists issued arrest warrants for terrorism or terrorism-related offences committed domestically, or those killed committing an act of terrorism. Okay, as an FYI up front, that's 139 actors in total. So it's not a massive number by any means. And as part of this exercise, we coded all of these 139 actors into a database across 26 unique variables. Just quickly in terms of the information itself, where we got it, about 70% or so of the data has come from court documents or from coronial inquests. So it's been pretty reliable information we've had for the most part to kind of fill this in, and we've supplemented that where we've had to with media reporting and other information. I do also want to note up front that we've developed both a short policy document and a longer academic article which spells out all of our findings and recommendations in much more detail than I'll be able to cover it in the next 10 minutes. So feel free to either reach out to myself or to Lorne if anyone wants a copy of these documents. So what did we find? Between this period, so between 2000 and the beginning of 2020, there were 13 domestic terrorist incidents perpetrated in Australia and Canada combined by jihadists. 7 in Australia, 6 in Canada. And of course we recognise that 13 is an extremely small sample we're looking at here, but there's a remarkable similarity both in the incidents and in terms of the perpetrators that have appeared across the two countries. First thing probably to note here is that Islamic State's inspired every one of these 13 incidents. And every one of these have occurred in the same 4-year period between late 2014 and late 2018. More specifically, all occurred in the months and years following the September 2014 declaration by the External Operations Emir of Islamic State, instructing the group's Western-based supporters to carry out acts that were targeting the West. So now this declaration really appears to have been what's empowered unaffiliated IS sympathisers in both Australia and Canada to not only act in the group's name, but also to act on their own. Picking up on Steve's conversation around lone actors, all of the 13 incidents that we're talking about that occurred in Australia and Canada, every one has been perpetrated by a lone actor. Drilling down into these individuals a little further, among the 7 Australian lone actors, 6 were male, 1 female. In the Canadian group, 5 male, 1 female. The average ages were also almost identical. The Australians averaging 27, the Canadians 28. In terms of the actual attacks themselves, the overwhelming majority were really simplistic, quite low resource attacks, and they were largely pretty unambitious in their scope. The majority only used edged weapons or low caliber firearms, and while they all managed to kind of successfully avoid detection, the trade-off is that these 13 low resource attacks only resulted in a total of 7 fatalities. So both Australia and Canada really managed to avoid that big spectacular attack. You know, that 9/11 or 7/7 London bombings that greatly impacts a society psychologically. So again, we're operating here in pretty similar contexts. Along with these lone actor attacks that both myself and Steve have talked a little bit about, another 21 jihadist plots were disrupted in Australia during this period, with 62 individuals in total charged there. On the flip side, Canada only disrupted 8 attacks. This is kind of a bit of the first discrepancy we get between the two countries. Looking a little bit into why this might be the case, if we isolate just the period prior to September 2014, again, the rise of Islamic State and that declaration, just 5 plots were disrupted in Australia. That was 30 arrests that came with those 5 plots. But notably, 5 plots were also intercepted in Canada, resulting in 25 arrests. So prior to September 2014, the scale of the jihadist threat to both countries was pretty much identical. The differences only really emerged after that September 2014 period, when Australia has had what was a pretty dramatic escalation in the number of jihadist plots that were either being planned or perpetrated. Along with the 7 attacks I've mentioned, there have been 16 disrupted or failed plots, equally divided between 8 lone actor and 8 group actor attacks. And every single one, again, has been linked to Islamic State. By contrast, we've only got the 3 plots that have been disrupted in Canada post-2014. So clearly IS has had much more success motivating those unaffiliated sympathisers in Australia than they've had in Canada. It's also probably worth noting here that despite a lot of the commentary from politicians or from the media, none of these post-2014 plots in either Australia or Canada have involved returned foreign fighters. Not one. If we then sort of take that group and we combine both data sets, we do see some interesting trends starting to appear. What I do think is particularly worth noting here is that while 60% of the plots have involved lone actors, these are divided between 13 successful lone actor attacks and 12 disrupted attacks. So that's about a 50% strike rate for lone actors in terms of both the Canadian and Australian context. On the flip side of that, regardless of kind of the target selected, the attack methodology, whatever international help they might have been getting from a terrorist organisation, every single group plot in Australia and Canada has so far been disrupted by security services across 20 years, every single one. So an increase in the level of threat posed by what Steve was talking about, these kind of hard to detect lone actors, the increase in the frequency of that really is a thing that's escalated our threat level in terms of being able to disrupt and stop attacks. When we combine these perpetrated attacks and those arrested attempting to commit attacks, together with those detained on terrorism-related charges, so I think disseminating propaganda, fundraising, being a member of the terrorist organisation, that type of thing. When we combine all of them together, that's where we get our 139 jihadist actors. 89 in Australia, 50 in Canada. Of the 89 Australians, 65 have so far been convicted, 11 are awaiting trial, and 5 were killed committing a terrorist act. That means 10% have been acquitted of all charges. They were issued a warrant, they went through the court process, but were ultimately acquitted. Looking across the 50 Canadians, 27 to date have been convicted, 3 were killed committing a terrorist act, 2 are still awaiting trial, and 14 have been acquitted of all charges. So there's 2 things I want to note about those numbers. I just kind of threw at you there without any context. Firstly, there's no repeat offenders. Quite simply, no Canadian or Australian jihadists have been convicted of terrorism sentences, convicted of terrorism offences, served a prison sentence, and then been rearrested for domestic offences upon release. Hasn't happened. We do know some individuals have become entangled with international organisations, and that's something we'll be looking at further in our foreign fighter sample in year 2. But domestically, terrorist reoffending after release is just not something we have any evidence of in either Australia or Canada. This really seems to be more of a political problem, kind of later, rather than something that's based on any sort of hard data at this stage. The second thing worth noting about those figures I threw at you is the discrepancy in the conviction rates. Approximately 3 in every 4 Australian jihadists have been convicted or imprisoned. In Canada, that number is closer to 2 in 4. On the flip side, that's 1 in every 10 Australians that have been convicted, that have been acquitted. 1 in every 10 Australians acquitted of terrorism charges. That number in Canada is closer to 3 in 10. Now, there's probably likely a series of factors that contribute to this difference, and we just don't have the time in this presentation to drill into the nuance of all those things that might be driving that. But that's certainly a noteworthy difference that's emerged, especially considering the real similarities between both the Australian and Canadian legal systems. Yeah, there's something there that needs to be looked at. Just looking quickly at a couple of the demographic factors underpinning these 139 actors before I finish up. Overall, the average age of Australians was 25, average age of Canadians was 26. So on the surface, it looks quite similar. But there's one pretty significant difference we did see across the period studied. If we look just at those arrested in Australia again prior to 2014, the average age was just over 28. But among those arrested post-2014, that average drops below 24. And probably most significantly here, more than 30% of Australian jihadists arrested since 2014 have been teenagers, compared to none in the period prior. So with an increase in the level of threat, there's come a decrease in the overall age profile of offenders in the last 5 or 6 years. And the emergence of teenagers as kind of a key part of the Australian network has some pretty clear implications for both counter-terrorism policy and CDE programming. For Canada, the age has also dropped, just not as dramatically. While it was 28 in the years pre-2014, it's dropped to just below 25 since the IS statement. So there, it's just not as big as what we've seen in Australia. And teenagers just have been a part of the jihadist networks in Canada over the last 20 years, reasonably consistently. Quickly, just with regard to education, among Australians, nobody had completed or even attempted postgrad study, and only 8% had completed an undergrad degree or college course. About 25% of the sample, the highest level of education they achieved was high school. So this means that 2/3 of Australian jihadists didn't even complete high school. On the flip side, Canadian jihadists are significantly better educated. One had a PhD and 54% completed an undergrad degree or at least enrolled in university, which is probably pretty far above the national average there. And while 67%, so 2/3 of Australians didn't finish high school, that's only 12% of Canadians that were high school dropouts. So 2 in every 3 Canadian jihadists had some form of higher education. 2 in every 3 Australians didn't even complete high school. Clearly, kind of educational attainment, while it's interesting and it's noteworthy, it doesn't in and of itself probably provide any useful data or anything too meaningful there, other than to say that in Australia we're probably not attracting the best of the brightest to the jihadist cause. The last significant thing, the finding that we've come across, I think is worth mentioning before I finish up, has to do with family connections. Among the Australian group of jihadists, more than 30% were related by either blood or marriage. In Canada, none were related by blood, and only 4 individuals were related by marriage. And this difference in the interconnectivity of the domestic networks, it's probably the biggest difference we're able to identify between the two contexts. We talk about this a little bit in the article. This interconnectivity means that Australian jihadists are far more geographically clustered. Their family units, they're married, they live in the same vicinities, compared to Canadian jihadists, which are much more spread throughout the provinces. They just don't know each other the way the Australian network does. So, in terms of kind of all the information I've given you, what does this actually mean in the real world? Probably the most meaningful insight we've come across is probably also the least surprising. We can say with a fair degree of certainty that the rise of Islamic State, and specifically that 2014 call for indiscriminate attacks against Western targets, caused a really clear spike in the overall level of threat. That declaration has just been an absolute game changer for both Australia and Canada. And this finding really kind of reinforces the idea that there are discernible trends in the regularity and nature of jihadist attacks. And regardless of how kind of Canadian or Australian societies function internally, we're simply just not immune from the impact of these global trends domestically. The similarity between Australia and Canada are probably also pretty significant in and of themselves. And if these similarities continue when we're looking across the sample of foreign fighters that we're now analysing, that probably quite reinforces a call for closer cooperation between Australians and Canadians. Whether we're talking law enforcement here or policy makers or researchers, the study really only kind of scratches the surface of where these overlaps might be, and there's probably a lot more we can learn through working cooperatively and comparing our contacts. Just on a personal level too, I also find this data really helpful when it comes to engaging with some of the current media or policy debates. Whether this is around prison radicalisation or the threat of people leaving prison and reoffending, or whether it's around the threat posed by ISIS returnees or how we target CBD programs, whatever the kind of debate of the day might be. Bluntly, there's a lot of uninformed speculation out there regarding who or what is or isn't a threat. And it's just nice to have that kind of really clear data to respond to some of this commentary, which often kind of isn't based on very much at all. Anyway, that's probably more than enough for me. Before I disappear off down that rabbit hole, I'll shut my mouth there. Thank you again to people for tuning in. And I'll hand you back to Veronica. Thank you for the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Just quickly, because it's directly related to your presentation, we've had someone in the questions ask whether it's possible to read either that policy report or the scholarly paper, whether they're out or not. Do you want to address that quickly?
I might hand that one to Lorne. The academic paper itself should be available, hopefully, in Perspectives in Terrorism in the next couple of days in the following issue. In terms of the policy document, Lorne, I'd imagine we'd be able to share that.
Yeah, and it's on the TSAS website, so people go to the TSAS website and download it from there. But I'll just note that the policy paper has a lot of the data, but a lot more of the kind of analysis and discussion and nuance is developed over many thousand more words in the paper that will be coming out in Perspectives on Terrorism shortly.
Thank you to Shannon and Lauren for that. It sounds like there's not going to be long to wait for that Perspective on Terrorism paper, so that's great. Okay, our final speaker today will be Gillian Hunchak, who is a researcher with Insight Threat Intelligence. She's also worked fairly recently for Moonshot CVE and the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. She has a master's degree in Terrorism, Security and Society from King's College in London. She's also a graduate of one of our TSAS summer academies. We are scheduled to do that again next summer. It's still a little bit up in the air exactly what that will look like or whether we'll try to postpone it. But stay tuned if that's something that interests you. And today, Gillian will speak to us about the far-right extremist threat in both English and French-speaking Canada, the risks that it poses, and the potential for growth. So thank you for being with us today, Gillian, and I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for hosting it. And of course, to echo Shandon, thank you to all of you for showing up on a Thursday afternoon. So today I'm going to be talking about right-wing extremism in the French and bilingual Canadian context. I'm going to take a bit of a different approach than the previous two presenters because this presentation will be talking about a project that hasn't actually happened yet. So unfortunately, I don't have any quantitative data for you yet. Hopefully we will in the next few months. But this presentation is basically the result of some preliminary research that I've been doing in advance of a research project that Jessica Davis of Insight Threat Intelligence and I will be conducting. So I just want to put that caveat out there that these are not conclusive findings, but the areas that we're planning on exploring a little bit further in the coming months. Many of the far-right groups and individuals in Canada actually are born out of and work within Francophone communities and societies. So as researchers, we do need to be aware of these groups and the whole landscape of the far-right threat in Canada. The second reason we wanted to look into this is that we believe that there are a few emerging themes coming out of the Francophone and bilingual far-right. And these are themes that are fairly unique and have the potential, I think, to sort of challenge the way that we understand the far right and possibly even challenge our perception or our definition and broaden our definition of how we understand the far right. So I want to talk about two of these themes today. The first is the motivation behind developing cross-national relationships by far-right groups and individuals. And then the second is something I'm calling French ethno-nationalism or Francophone ethno-nationalism. So I'll go into more about what that is and how it can sort of contribute a new flavor to the far-right that we're seeing in Canada. Cross-national relationships. The first thing to say, of course, is that this is not a new phenomenon. Over the last several years, we've seen groups and individuals across the globe attempting to reach out to other far-right individuals internationally and make connections. Groups in Canada have been no exception to this. The best and probably most relevant example right now are the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys have 3,000 members, estimated 3,000 members worldwide, and 15 chapters just across Canada alone. This screenshot here, I hope it's big enough for everybody to see, is from a far-right social media. Oh dear. Far-right social media website where the Proud Boys Calgary are retweeting Trump's call to stand back and stand by during the first presidential debate. So even though this is not a new phenomenon, individuals reaching out abroad, I do believe that the Francophone far right in Canada has a few unique reasons to be doing this. And so we can explore those. The first reason is simply necessity. There's a general lack, I think, of popular and active French language forums based in Canada. Typically, the largest and the most well-known far-right platforms and landing pads online are based abroad. There's a list on the right-hand side of the screen here of some of these platforms, and these are, I would say, the most active and popular for French language far-right speakers. French language far-right individuals and groups, and they are all based out of Europe or outside of Canada. This screenshot is pulled from one of those platforms, and the poster is asking whether there are any Québécois users on the website and requests that they get in touch if so they can organize. So basically, the desire to find a larger community of people, French speakers who share the same values as the far-right individual might, will sort of inevitably lead people to interact and make connections with people abroad. But the second reason is quite a bit more interesting, and it's that the use of one or both languages, which is to say French or English, actually allows Francophone extremists to broaden their reach and their scope. So as of 2016, which is the most recent census data available, 6.2 million Canadians felt comfortable communicating in either English or French. One of these individuals is this man pictured here, Gabriel Fourier-Chaput. His online handle is Zyger. He is a Francophone neo-Nazi. He was active primarily between 2016 and 2018, based out of Montreal. And he was a recruiter. He wrote 2 books, and he ended up becoming sort of a minor celebrity among both Anglophone and Francophone far-right communities in Canada. This is a photo of him as well at the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which speaks to his ability to form more international connections. So Zyger was effectively able to weaponize his bilingualism to kind of further the messaging of the far right just that much further and reach, that much more of an audience. And it's worth asking ourselves as researchers, how many people are doing the same? Is this a common trend that we're actually seeing among bilingual speakers in Canada, among the far right? What I want to talk about is what we're calling francophone ethno-nationalism, and the unique components that this concept can sort of bring to our understanding of the far right. So French Canada, of course, has a very long history of both real and perceived discrimination and victimization. This has led to lots of unrest in Canada's history, including longstanding separatist and francophone nationalist movements, which led to a very violent period between 1963 and 1970 at the hands of the FLQ. And when I talk about francophone ethno-nationalism, this is a very basic definition, but we're basically referencing French Canadians who are attempting to reclaim what they see as their rightful land. They want to reclaim their culture and political power within Canada. And so, it very much applies to separatist ideologies. Now, this history, very long history of francophone ethno-nationalism, I believe, has infused itself fairly strongly into modern far-right groups within Canada. And the best example of this is a group called Atalante. Now, Atalante is a francophone group founded in 2015. They are nationalists, but they are not nationalists in the way that we traditionally would define it. Oh my. Stay there. Right, so they're not nationalists in the way that we would traditionally understand far-right nationalism. They believe and feel as if French Canadians have suffered greatly under the reign of British colonialism, and want to reclaim what they see as their traditional and effectively native territory. But they differ at some fairly crucial junctures and show and demonstrate something a little bit different from what we normally understand the far right to be. So I've listed a few of these points here. The first is that they're forward-looking. They're not traditionalists. This differs to the extent that many far-right groups wish to sort of look back into the past and they have a desire to return to that they understand as an idealized or mythologized past when their society was purer, which often just means whiter, and everything was just made more sense. Atalante, on the other hand, doesn't wish to do this. They see their society as being broken, but they want to gather up all of the best parts and move forward to create a new future. The second point is that they actually align themselves with Indigenous populations, and this is very unique. Many far-right groups, again, will twist themselves into pretzels, trying to avoid, discussing Indigenous populations, particularly in Western countries where Aboriginal groups exist. And this is often because, just the very presence and existence of Indigenous populations challenges the basic ideology of far-right groups, which is that they own this land and they have a right to this land. On the other hand, Atalante doesn't believe that. They actually see themselves on a fairly level playing ground with Indigenous groups, because they see themselves as French Canadians also having suffered fairly strongly at the hands of British colonial powers. And so it's a similar, they see themselves as being in a similar position as Indigenous populations. The third point is that they shift away from capitalism. They want to see a society built in which a government is able to take care of all of its rightful citizens. In this photo here, you can see an Atalante member giving food to somebody on the street, you could argue that this is sort of a social service that he's providing to somebody that he believes is deserving of his aid, which is, say, ethnically French Canadian. And again, this differs because many far-right groups typically shy away from anything they see as being socialism or communism, and would rather not touch those ideologies. And then finally, the last point is that Atalante rejects the idea or the label of white nationalism and actively tries to reach out and form relationships with nationalist groups in other countries. And this simply goes back to my first point about, far-right groups and individuals reaching out and creating international relationships. These two things lead us to a number of research questions, which effectively boil down to an underlying question, which is, do the factors of language use or the presence of an ethno-nationalist history challenge the frameworks that we typically attribute to the far right? Are we seeing something new, or are we able to, encompass these far right French and bilingual groups into what we already recognize and understand as the far right? To this end, over the next few months, Jessica Davis and I will be investigating the questions written here. How often and in what ways is language or bilingualism weaponized by far-right individuals? How does the historical influence of French ethno-nationalism impact the organization, the ideologies, and the actions of far-right groups in Canada? And effectively, are these factors simply variables, or do they fundamentally impact how we understand and categorize these groups? Do we need a new definition or a new framework for what we're seeing here? These will be the questions that we're investigating over the next few months, and we hope to have some answers for you soon. So stay tuned. Thanks very much.
Just on a forward-looking note about what we might hear about in months to come. We have a few questions now coming up in the chat, but I'm actually going to use my prerogative to ask the first one because it's more of a definitional question, and this is actually a question for Steve. It struck me in your discussion of lone actor terrorism and gender that you included at least one case that some might have been tempted to classify as assassination, perhaps the very first one with Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the person who assassinated Thomas D'Arcy McGee. So I'm curious about whether you make a distinction, because both of those typically are seen to have political element. But I think more interestingly, how do we distinguish between misogynist-inspired terrorism and other kinds of misogynist mass violence? So I'm thinking of the Halifax shooter this spring, where he very clearly had a misogynist motivation. I'm thinking about the attacks in the Ottawa Valley, and I'm pretty sure it was 2015. And whether those are cases that we should think about similarly or differently from something like, say, the Montreal Polytechnique massacre.
Obviously, looking at the Thomas D'Arcy McGee killing, actually, people didn't talk about terrorism at all then. And this is something that's been discussed in the historical community. Beverly Gage, who's written a really good history of the Wall Street bombing of 1920, talks about whether you can discuss terrorism pre-people using that label. And I would argue the reason I include it is I see it as a form of political violence, and that fits with the definition of terrorism. So I think it can be both, actually. It could be assassination and an act of terrorism. That's a really interesting debate, because you think of something like Lee Harvey Oswald and the killing of Kennedy, and whether it's assassination. Is there a political agenda as well? The misogyny question is also a great question. I mean, the reason I included those two is because, in effect, I mean, with Lapine, and there's a really interesting study to look at the way the Lapine's horrible crime has been viewed over time and how it is now being at times labeled as terrorism. But Lapine left sort of almost I don't know if you can call it a manifesto, but certainly made it clear as to why he carried out the attacks. Obviously, the Toronto case is ongoing, but he seems to have also indicated his motivation. So that was sort of my criteria, where there was a clear motivation and not just someone committing a crime. So I would argue for broadening the definition. And again, and I think this is one of the problems perhaps in the way that we define certain things as terrorism and not. And it obviously gets into the whole politicized concept of terrorism. You know, we can look at something like, there's a great book by Lisa Stepnitsky looking at the birth of terrorism studies and the way that certain things get labeled. So, for instance, the Contras in the 1980s are not labeled as terrorists. But obviously, if the Contras were not connected to the U.S. government and were carrying out similar acts of violence, most likely the label of terrorism would have been
reminding me of it. And of course, how we define terrorism as researchers is different from how it is sometimes defined in the media, and is then different again from kind of a legal definition of terrorism, which is sort of what underlies a lot of Shandon's work, which is much more focused on prosecutions and terrorist outcomes. So I'm going to move now to a question that's directed at him. I think I had one there. The question was, you did come up with an interesting difference in the education levels of the Canadian and Australian and so the question was whether you think that that's just noise in the data, or whether there might actually be some kind of qualitative difference in the way that education plays a role in radicalization in those two countries.
I think the quick kind of headline part there would be I don't know. We can kind of speculate. I mean, again, we're not dealing with massive numbers, so a few can distort this one way or the other, but there do seem to be discernible trends in there. I think partly it can possibly be explained at least a little bit with the age discrepancy, where the Australians do tend to be a little bit younger overall, but particularly post-2014 with the rise in the number of teenagers we've seen. Obviously, teenagers getting involved in terrorism, you're not going to have high levels of educational outcomes there. So I think that the lower age in Australia could possibly account for some of that discrepancy. As for the rest of it, I think that's one of those open questions that probably needs, whether it's a dedicated research project or somebody specifically looking at that question. Because, from the raw data where we're able to pinpoint it, we can kind of put a hand up and go, there's something there. But in terms of explaining it, we probably don't have the tools and the data. I don't know, Lauren, did you want to
chime in a little bit more? But I mean, that last point is the key thing that Shannon just said, is because really what it points to is here's an issue that has been bandied about for like a decade or more, and yet we still really have not cracked it or explained it well, and the data is really poor. But if you look at I've had reason to look at a bunch of studies in the European context, etc. And in Europe, we don't have adequate data, but it fits with the Australian pattern. I mean, basically, it's low educational levels associated with people involved in jihadist terrorism. But the United States, like Canada, has the reverse. United States, from what limited data we have, but it's pretty good data, there seems to be people, a disproportionately large number of people with quite high levels of education. And actually, potentially, I haven't done a direct comparison, it may even be higher in the United States. So one thing we can draw from this is this, overwhelming, repeated effort to identify jihadist terrorism with social economic marginalization. Well, one, wrench thrown into that dominant scenario is the fact that at least in two countries, we have data that just doesn't fit with that in terms of at least the educational levels. And so this is, mainly I would agree with Shannon. It means, wow, this tells you we really need to go back and figure this out better and hunt for this data better. When you go into most other data sets, the reports on educational levels is one of the weakest. They just don't have the data.
The other thing I just kind of mention with that, particularly picking up on the Australian and Canadian context here, is if we compare that to, say, the French situations you had us or other areas in Europe or in the Middle East, there's going to be structural differences which could explain this. But again, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but we did eyeball the kind of educational attainment levels looking across, immigrant populations and breaking down through different diasporas in both Canada and Australia, and there weren't too many differences there. So I think on some level, at least at a high level, we can probably rule out, something structural here. I think that's one of the advantages of going with very similar contexts that, we're not comparing it to Kazakhstan. We're not comparing it to somewhere that's just going to have a vastly different system of education and societal structures. So I would say at a really high level, we can probably rule out any of those sort of clear structural elements that just say, Muslims are disproportionately more poorly educated in Australia versus Canada. Those numbers just aren't there on that kind of high level area. But I think, as Lorne says, that there's just a lot there we just don't know.
Well, there might be a correlation between educational level and the family connections, because I think you also noticed that in Australia, more likely to be, I think, groups of siblings or married spouses, and I guess we might guess that maybe families are likely to have similar levels of education, so that could be playing. And again, like small numbers, it's really hard to figure out what's noise and what's a trend. So thank you very much for that discussion. The next question I have is for Gillian, which is about the directions of influence. Do you know yet, and I know you're just getting into this research, whether we see the same kind of attempts at global influence from the Francophone far right in Europe trying to expand into Quebec, or is this primarily a Quebec into other Francophone states and cultures question?
I saw that question in the comments, and I'm so glad you asked it because it was really exciting. The short answer is no, we don't know yet. Lacking any quantitative data, it's going to be really difficult to answer. What I can tell you is that having done some preliminary research and looking at forums and chat rooms, mainly people are going from Quebec into Europe in the sense, like what I talked about in my presentation, in the sense of trying to find larger communities of people who share their ideologies. However, there's a really interesting trend, I think, and we'll need to back this up with numbers, but I've seen quite a few people in Europe interrogating Quebecois people what life is like in Canada, and they sort of have this, they appear to have this sort of idealized image of Canada as being this, much like whiter and purer nation. And I've even seen some individuals talking about, wanting to move there eventually, specifically coming out of France, because far-right individuals and groups in France really double down on immigration numbers and talk about that being a really big issue. So I would say we can break it down by saying the amount of people engaging goes from Canada into Europe, but the amount of people discussing, quality of life and being curious about where to live and where to find their idealized society goes the other direction. Again, hopefully within the next few months we'll be able to back that up with data, but it is a very interesting trend.
Thank you, Gillian. I have a question again for Steve that's also sort of a question about trends versus noise in the data. You noted that a lot of the attacks, and I think Shandon actually noted the same thing, that a lot of these attacks were low resource attacks, and that seems to be a pattern with lone actor terrorism. And we have a questioner wondering whether there might be any relationship between financing and gender, or financing and, let's say, demographics more broadly, the kinds of people who are likely to commit terrorist attacks. So I'm actually going to throw this out to both Steve and Shandon, because I know you both have the kind of data that may or may not be able to help you answer this question.
I mean, that's an extremely interesting question, and certainly a question, obviously, that applies here in the UK as well. When you look at lone actor terrorism, that you've had these recent cases of people just literally buying 2-for-1 knives in order to carry out attacks. So I think there might be a correlation between issues around employment, issues around income, issues around what can be achieved. And effectively what you have now are people engaging in what I would call doable terrorism, taking whatever they can in order to be able to carry out an attack. Where I'm right now is literally less than 2 miles from where the Westminster Bridge attacker lived in a flat in Birmingham. And that was someone, obviously, who rented a car and took a knife and carried out an attack, and someone who had struggled financially in advance of that.
Like that?
I guess I possibly disagree with Steve here just on one thing, and I'm going to channel academic Peter Nessa here, who talks about potential issues with just looking at incidents in isolation and not also including disruptive attacks. Because if we look across the total number of kind of planned lone actor attacks in Australia and Canada, the number kind of balloons out. I can't think of the exact number off the top, but we're talking sort of 20 plus in the last 20 years, or around 20, something like that. What we see with the ones that have been successful, as in success of being able to carry out the attack, they've been the really low resource ones. As talked about, the ones with, kind of just a knife or, a really low caliber firearm that's stolen, or those easily accessible weapons and plots that are being put together in 5 minutes, they're really difficult for security services to disrupt. So they tend to be the ones that get through. There's certainly examples of lone actors that have tried to be a bit more sophisticated. And we're not talking, Anders Breivik kind of levels of sophistication here, but there have been individuals who have tried to put together more comprehensive attacks and more sophisticated attacks. And that planning process is what's led them to be discovered by security services. So I think there's certainly something in there, but I think it speaks a bit more to what's detectable and what's possible for police and intelligence agencies to intercept. And those low resource attacks just tend to be the ones that slip through because they're really kind of hard to predict.
Thank you. Gillian, I have one more question for you, and then I have two that I'm going to throw out to the whole panel. Sorry, Lauren, did you have something you wanted to add on that question?
Yeah, just so I don't want to butt in too much here, but just an interesting point here, because you get the interface of interesting elements, and this might even play in the case of Steve's research coming out, and that is, the thing that was the most dominant factor determining the pattern of attacks in Canada and Australia was the call from ISIS in 2014. And what that call did was ideologically legitimate low-resource attacks. So it basically said, even if you just take a knife and stab someone, you're a martyr. So it elevated the status of these attacks, where previously there might have been this onus within the jihadist circles, at any rate, that to really be a martyr, you had to be engaged in some spectacular, dramatic attack, a coordinated attack. Suddenly now it was legitimate to be a martyr on a par with the 9/11 attackers, just by doing something simple. So you get, there may be a financial component, but you get an interesting ideological component as well.
So the last sort of directed question for Gillian is about whether you have yet any hypotheses about taking sort of more of Steve Hewitt's historical view about the relationship between the FLQ, which obviously emerges also out of French Francophone Canadian culture and modern right-wing Francophone movements, and then related to that, Was there a reason for using ethno-nationalism specifically rather than sort of civic nationalism, which might be considered a broader term?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In terms of the term that I chose, quite honestly, and I'm sorry to say this, it was one of the first terms that I came up with, and I've run with it for this presentation. So it may not be the most accurate, and as we move forward with our research project, we will likely be looking at that to change. But I guess, the reasoning behind it was this idea of ethno-nationalism and ethnicity being so central to the ideologies of the far right, and just wanting to punctuate that a little bit. And then, I'm sorry, Veronica, could you just clarify the second part of the question?
Whether you have seen in your research yet, or have anything to say about the relationship between the older FLQ tradition of terrorism and the more recent emergence of right-wing terrorism in Francophone Canada?
Right, thank you. Yeah, so this is interesting, and again, as we carry on, I will have better answers. But I will just say for now, the thing that really links you to time frames and sort of how the history has been brought into the present is this underlying theme of sort of martyrdom and victimization and a desire for separatism that's come out of French Canada. And it's really interesting because whereas in the 1970s, with the FLQ and other groups, we see that as being the main focus of their campaigns and their ideologies. Today, we see a lot of far-right groups in French-speaking groups, which, for all intents and purposes, you would label neo-Nazi, you would label white nationalist, and lots of, other focuses that they have. Okay. Anyway, but there's sort of an underlying current among French right-wing groups that there is still this desire for separatism, and there's this, they've brought a lot of these ideologies from the FLQ and from former groups into the present. And so the question really becomes, what factors do those underlying currents play in the development of the Francophone neo-Nazi group? Can we still just call it a neo-Nazi group, even though they're advocating for, a separate state from the rest of Canada, or does that become something different? I hope that answers the question.
The last question I want to sort of build on something that has come up in the chat. Is sort of a broader question about each of your relationships to what you study. It's I think always challenging for those of us who research violence broadly or terrorism specifically to imagine ourselves in the mindsets of the people we study, because in many ways it seems so foreign to anything that we might ever imagine. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about whether there's any particular challenges related to doing your research in terms of sort of trying to understand things like motivations, trying to understand things like ethno-nationalism in a francophone context as a non-francophone. And whether any of you have had those kinds of issues come up methodologically, and how you think about them in your research. So I'll invite Steve to go first again.
I speak obviously as a historian, and to give you a specific example in response, so I have a paper in the Canadian Historical Review, an article about that 1966 attack, and it was an amazing amount of material. It was both RCMP, FBI investigation, because the individual had crossed the border and had lived in the U.S. and in Canada. I had complete documentation. I had his birth certificate. I had interviews with people that knew him. And it was an incredible amount of material. I had all of his writings, love letters that he wrote to a woman in Los Angeles. And he even wrote his own memoir and self-published it. And yet, still in the end, I'm not completely sure as to why he did what he did, despite having all of that information and kind of insights into the way he was thinking. And the police themselves were baffled and then just put it down to mental health issues, even though there was very little evidence that he had mental health issues. So yeah, this is certainly, obviously we can speak in wide patterns, but in terms of, I think it's so complex as to why an individual actually carries out an act of violence, because there's lots of people that are angry. There's lots of men that are angry. But it's only a small proportion that ever act on that. And again, obviously this is a question that bedevils many of us, but I don't see that changing. And I think often policymakers want sort of silver bullet answers to why, because how do we stop it in the future? And again, I just say this as a historian looking backwards, and I'm sure the social scientists might disagree, but I'm not sure that there ever will be such answers forthcoming.
Shannon, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess kind of stepping outside of this project specifically, but talking with a kind of broader researcher hat on, I think this speaks exactly to your methodology in terms of any research project that's being conducted. In terms of my sort of professional capacity, I do a bit of work here that has to do with risk assessment. So looking at an individual and trying to understand, what's going on in terms of things that you're seeing, whether they're reported behaviors, whether they're, things that might be being planned. And one of the things that I don't think we've done well in the kind of CVE or counterterrorism world, that kind of step into the practitioner part, is understanding exactly what you can and can't kind of understand. As Steve speaks to, you can have amazing amounts of data, birth certificate, stories about people's upbringing, their educational attainment, all these kind of demographic factors, but still not understand what's actually going on. If you want to have that question, you specifically mentioned motivation, Veronica. Bluntly, if you want to know anything about motivation, you're going to have to talk to the person. There is simply just no other way to understand it. We can kind of take snippets here. We can look at someone's manifesto and maybe read into that a little bit, to some extent, a glorified version of what they want to put on paper. But we can get some insights from manifestos. But I think when it comes to what made an individual do it, and specifically that why question, why did an individual go and do it? That's a methodology question where, whether it's in a prison context or field work, somebody's going to have to go and actually talk to the person and engage with them to figure that bit out.
Well, it's interesting is, of course, even if you do go talk to them, they may have a particular story that they want to share with you, and particular politicized reasons for telling you certain things and not telling you other things. So yeah, I actually think this even gets into the question of research ethics and not just methodology, and how to the extent to which you can distinguish between someone's internal, whether you can ever really access their motivations, and how a research process looks different if you're trying to access motivations versus if you're just trying to build an argument based on what they put in the public record, for instance, which would be something like a manifesto or their social media, something like that. Jillian, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'm so glad that you just brought that up. The idea that you can never really understand, or potentially never really understand, somebody's motivation. It's a really good question about the difficulties as a researcher. I think I saw somebody in the chat just mentioning, are any of your researchers Francophone? The answer is no, currently. And that is a challenge. Both of us speak French, but we did not grow up in a Francophone culture. And, sort of understanding the nuances of a culture and the nuances, especially of the online world, which is just learning a different language in itself, can be very, very challenging. And I think there are a few ways that we can combat this. The first is to have, somebody, quote unquote, on the inside that you can talk to, a native French speaker or somebody who is more familiar with the culture than you are, or ideally multiple people, because each person may have a different interpretation of what's going on. But something I want to note as well, and going back to what you said, Veronica, is that I did my undergraduate degree in anthropology, and one of the things you learn fairly early on is that, I'm part of a Western Canadian culture, and I don't understand this culture entirely. You will never, even the culture and society that you are a part of, there will be things that you miss. I don't know what music is hot these days. There are so many things that you miss out on, even within your own culture. And so on the one hand, that is a disadvantage, because there are certain things and nuances that inevitably over the next few months we're going to miss out on. On the other hand, it gives you an interesting point of view coming in from the outside, and looking at something new, that, maybe people within that culture or ideology take for granted, terms, that are floating around that everybody just uses and we're not entirely sure where they came from. Memes even, so it's a very tricky thing. And there are certain things that you can do to mitigate the chance that you'll miss out on something. But I would say that, there can be an advantage to being an outsider if you approach the research correctly.
And thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to Kirsty and Elizabeth for their technical work in the background, and of course to DFSG and TSAS for co-hosting this event and making it possible. We're right at 3:30, so well done all of us for staying to time. And I would invite you to check out the websites of both DFSG and TSAS to find out about our events. Everybody, it has been an honor and a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon, and I wish you well in the rest of your day.